This is part 8 of the Iron Islands. In part 7, I talked about Harren the Black, the last Whore King. When Aegon Targaryen came to Westeros and burned Harren and his sons in Harrenhal, Aegon booted the Ironborn from the Riverlands after they controlled it for almost 3 generations. Then Aegon made the Tullys Lords of the Trident. The sudden death of Harren and his heirs, along with many great Ironborn warriors and lords, both from the burning of Harrenhal and the Riverlands rising up against any Ironborn left in the area, plunged the Iron Islands into chaos. While a few Ironborn had made it to the coast and found longships that weren't burnt, the loss of a clear heir and the death of many great Ironborn lords that might take over in the Whore's stead made it uncertain who should take over the islands. Aegon, who had caused this chaos, didn't pay attention to the Ironborn as they began to immediately fight for who should rule the Iron Islands. Instead, Aegon continued on with his conquest and left the islands to fend for themselves. The first man to claim kingship of the islands was Qhorin Marc, a minor lord of Harlaw whose grandmother had been a younger sister of Harwin Hardhan, Harren's grandfather. But while he declared himself the rightful heir of the Black Line, on Old Wyck, 40 priests had gathered at Naga's Bones to give one of their own a driftwood crown. The man they chose was a barefoot holy man named Lodos, a man that claimed to be the living son of the drowned god. And I really wish they gave us more information on how he convinced the other priests to accept this as truth. Besides Lodos and Qhorin, men from Great Wyck, Orkmont, and Pike all came forward to claim kingship of the islands. For over a year, followers of each man began to fight each other by land and sea. And once more, Ironborn infighting had devastating results, causing the islands to become even more impoverished. Finally, in 2 AC, Aegon decided that he had left the Ironborn to their own devices long enough. Flying over on his dragon and with a large war fleet, he landed on Great Wyck. With the coming of Aegon, the priest King Lodos, while on Old Wyck, called on Krakens to drag down Aegon's warships and stop his attack on the islands. While Lodos was busy summoning Krakens on Old Wyck, Aegon killed Qhorin with his Valyrian steel blade Blackfire on Great Wyck. When Lodos noticed that no Krakens had appeared to take care of Aegon and his men, the priest king decided the best course of action was to fill his robes with stones, walk into the sea, and take counsel with his father. Thousands of his men followed him into the sea, and for years to come, their bloated corpses would wash up on the shores of the islands. Except for Lodos's body. Strangely enough, his body was never found. Maybe he did return to his dad. Given how poor and exhausted the Ironborn were from years of war even before their recent infighting, the Ironborn quickly gave up after Aegon slew Qhorin and Lodos failed to convince his father to let him borrow some Krakens. Bending the knee to Aegon, they swore loyalty to House Targaryen. This left Aegon with the task of deciding who should rule the islands as a lord. Some of the mainlanders told Aegon to make the Ironborn vassals of Lord Tully of Riverrun, and others told them to make the Ironborn vassals of Casterly Rock. Obviously, feelings of payback and anger motivating these suggestions. Because not only had the Ironborn subjugated and tormented the Riverlands, but for centuries they had attacked and harassed much of the west coast of the mainland. Making the Ironborn beneath the Lords of Riverrun or the Lords of Casterly Rock and run by them would utterly humiliate the Ironborn, and I'm sure that thought put a smile on some of the mainlanders' faces. The dislike for the Ironborn was so strong that some even begged Aegon to wipe the Ironborn from the earth and scour the Isles clean with dragon flame. Instead of those options, Aegon decided to gather the lords of the Iron Islands together and let them choose their own lord. This decision gave the Ironborn a sense of control over their islands and ruler, even if Aegon would always be ready to crush them under his thumb should they cause problems. The Ironborn chose a famous captain descended from the Grey King, Vicon Greyjoy, Lord Reaper of Pike. At this point in time, the Greyjoys had a long and distinguished lineage going all the way back to the Kingsmoot, where only the Grey Irons and Good Brothers had produced more kings than the Greyjoys. Their selection of Vicon began the long rule of the Greyjoys over the Iron Islands. Vicon was a stern and cautious ruler. While he didn't outlaw reaving, he made sure that his people raided in distant waters, as to not upset the Targaryens by raiding the coasts of Westeros. That gave them little reason to go to the mainland, and the Ironborn became more removed from it and the affairs of court at King's Landing. Through Vicon's rule, the Iron Islands began to heal from the chaos that had enveloped the land after Harren's fall, though it would take almost a generation to truly recover. But life wasn't exactly back to normal for the Ironborn. Under the Targaryens, with Aegon accepting the faith of the Seven as his gods, Lord Vicon was basically forced to allow Septons back on the islands to preach the faith. Many Ironborn were not happy with this and began to grumble. In other parts of the Ironborn series, I talked about how the Iron Islands had risen up against the faith a few times, so allowing the Septons and Septas on the Isles was a dangerous move on Vicon's part. However, despite pious Ironborn and priests of the drowned god being enraged, Lord Vicon did not budge, and in response to the unrest, he said, "Let them preach. We have need of winds to fill our sails." He then reminded his son Goren he was Aegon's man, and no man but a fool would dare rise against Aegon Targaryen and his dragons. When Lord Vicon died in 33 AC, his son Goren succeeded him as Lord of the Iron Islands, and he remembered his father's words. Things weren't as peaceful for Goren, though. First, he put down an uncoordinated conspiracy to put Cornwall, Marc's son, on the throne and restore the Black Line. Obviously, some feelings of disgust for the faith being allowed on the islands helped this conspiracy form. Next, Goren had another problem when 4 years later, Aegon the Conqueror died of a stroke on Dragonstone, and his son Aenys the First Targaryen came to the throne. Aenys the First was an incredibly weak king, and soon rebellions broke out across the Seven Kingdoms. One revolt occurred on the islands led by a man that claimed to be Lotus the Priest King returned from visiting his father. Goren wasted no time in shutting down the revolt, and soon sent the drowned god's son's pickled head to Aenys Targaryen. Aenys, extremely pleased with this show of loyalty, promised him any reward within his power to grant. Smart as he was vicious, Lord Greyjoy asked Aenys I to expel all Septons and Septas from the Iron Islands. Given his promise to grant Lord Greyjoy anything in his power, the king was forced to agree. And this resulted in a century passing before another sept was opened on the islands. After Goren, Greyjoy lords followed and continued to have little to do with the affairs of the mainland, while commanding avoidance of conquest and instead encouraged the Ironborn to live by trade, fishing, and mining. But some of the Ironborn craved the return of the old way, to when they were feared and considered wolves of the sea. But between the Greyjoy stern rule and how distant the Summer Sea and Stepstones were, these cravings had to remain dreams for a very long time. But no matter how much time passed between the old days of the islands, priests continued standing in the sea, preaching the old way, and in hundreds of brothels and taverns, old men told of the glorious days when the old ways ruled. The Ironborn were proud and rich, and every oarsman had a dozen salt wives in his bed. These stories only made the younger generations hunger for this glory and want to return to the Reaver life. Finally, after a century of dreaming and hoping for the return of the old ways, the Kraken woke. This Kraken was Dalton Greyjoy, a wild, fearless, hot-tempered, and headstrong young man, an heir to Pike and the Iron Islands, who was said to love three things: the sea, his sword, and women. He was rowing by the age of 5, reaving at the age of 10, sailing with his uncle to raid pirate towns. By 14, Dalton had sailed as far as Old Gis, claimed 4 salt wives, and fought in a dozen actions. This boy would become Lord of the Iron Islands by the age of 16, and in part 9 of this series, I want to talk about Dalton Greyjoy attempting to return the Iron Islands to glory, the eventual chaos the Iron Islands once again were plunged into, and then in part 10, I'll end the Ironborn series. From there, we'll likely be beginning the month of dark, scary videos like I did last year for the month of October. From there, we'll return to talking about the North in November. Thank you for watching. Please give the video a thumbs up, even if you hate the Ironborn. There's only 2 more parts left for them, so we're almost done. Have a great week.